Welcome to this brief presentation reviewing research methods. The next part of your research project unit study is to produce an essay related to the methods that are used within the study. What this presentation tries to do is initially differentiate the differences between what's called methodology and the methods. And coming from an engineering background, I'm putting an engineering perspective on this. When I first started doing educational research, I had to make a transition from being an engineer in a scientific environment to being an educationalist in a more social science environment. And that was quite a different transition to make. And one of the problems I had initially was coming to terms with the methodology I'd been using in the scientific context, which is called the scientific method. We're now trying to do research in a social science context in education, and how different methodologies and different research methods are required within that field of study. This is a brief presentation that tries to outline the difference between methodology and methods, and also quantitative versus qualitative research, and also primary and secondary research. These are quite confusing terms. Although these terms are not rocket science, they do cause confusion for students undertaking a research project for the first time. This presentation is aimed at answering the P4 criterion. We've got to examine appropriate research methods and approaches to primary and secondary research. What we're going to do in the study is to define some terminology, as outlined on the previous slide, and then focus on different types of research methods you may want to consider within the essay you'll need to produce to satisfy this criterion. There are grading criteria to be satisfied if you want to attempt higher grades. The M3 grading criteria says discuss merits, limitations and pitfalls of approaches to data collection and data analysis. And distinction criterion D2 also relates partially to the research methods used, in that you have to critically analyse data analysis conducted and strategies to deal with the challenges. So as an engineer or a scientist in the research field, we tendency to use what's called quantitative research methodology. It's sometimes termed the scientific method. And below are the characteristics of this scientific method. First of all, it's a basic process that all researchers follow when exploring a specified topic or an area of research. And applying the scientific method should hopefully reduce the researcher's bias and lead to more accurate research findings. This approach is a standardized way of making observations, gathering data, forming theories, testing predictions, hypotheses, and interpreting results. So this process generates repeatable results that other researchers should be able to replicate. Researchers may make observations in order to describe and measure behavior. For example, in a laboratory, we might use test specimens as part of an engineering research, or maybe we might be using an array of people as participants in a psychological research project. Here's an outline of the quantitative research methodology, or the scientific method as it's sometimes termed. It starts with an observation or a question that needs to be answered. We review the literature on this particular topic area, undertake a literature review. Relevant theory may evolve from literature review that we have to consider and understand. From the literature review, we develop a proposal and generate a hypothesis that needs testing. We will devise appropriate experiments and undertake the tests. We will then analyse the test data collected and the results found, and then we will present findings and conclusions to our appropriate audience. The cycle then may be repeated because from the findings we may have different observations and different questions, and so it becomes a cyclic scientific method here. To try and show the difference between a quantitative study and a qualitative study, let's consider the outline of a structure for a possible final report from our research. As we mentioned previously, the quantitative study is more so for the physical sciences. That includes research in engineering context, whereas the qualitative study is more so for the social sciences, for example, sociological orientated research or educational research. So considering the structure for a quantitative study, we will no doubt start the report with an abstract. We will have an introduction related to the background to the research. We will have a hypothesis that we put forward for testing and associated objectives. We will undertake a literature review, which will no doubt highlight some theory, maybe some mathematical theory on which the hypothesis can be based. We will then devise an experiment and undertake some testing, from which we will gather data and results, undertake an analysis, and then we will draw conclusions and recommendations. If we contrast the quantitative study structure for the report with a qualitative study report structure, we will again no doubt have an abstract and introduction, but then we will have research questions as opposed to hypothesis, which will essentially form the objectives of what we're trying to achieve. We will undertake a literature review, but we will also have a section, no doubt, which outlines methodology and method. Because unlike the quantitative study, where the methodology and the research methods are all based around what's called the scientific method, which is an approach that's generally accepted throughout the scientific community, with qualitative study, the methodology and methods that can be assumed can be quite diverse, and so we need to define them in the context of our study. Also, often we have to consider ethical issues. Now, there are ethical issues associated with quantitative work, because it might be we're undertaking the research for a particular company, and from an ethical standpoint, we must make sure we do not divulge any company-sensitive information that might be advantageous to our competitors. So there's an ethical consideration around quantitative study. However, with qualitative research, where we're most likely interviewing or surveying people, we need to be very careful about our ethical approach. So in most cases, we will have to consider completing an ethical application form to show the ethics board of a university, etc., that we have considered our ethical stance throughout the duration of a research project, and ensure things like confidentiality and anonymity to our participants. So the methodology and methods and the ethics section must be considered in a qualitative study. There will be a data analysis section in our qualitative study, but again that can involve a variety of different data analysis techniques. We'll have a discussion and finding section and a conclusion and recommendation section. But hopefully you can see from contrasting the proposed report structures there for a quantitative and qualitative study that there are some differences between these two types of research, and so we need to be clear about methodology and methods. The rest of the presentation tries to clarify and emphasize these differences. Let's now consider quantitative versus qualitative research. So in qualitative research, the advantages are it's flexible, can often adjust the method as the research unfolds to help aid the development of new knowledge, and it can be conducted on quite small samples. A disadvantage of qualitative research is that data collected cannot be analysed statistically, or often cannot be generalised to a broader population. It's quite difficult to standardise research from a qualitative study. For example, if you survey technician students at a small college to find their perspectives on assessment practice, for example, it might be very difficult to translate those findings to another town, another college where technician engineering students are studying, because there are so many variables involved that are beyond your control, such as the subject studied, such as the classroom size, such as the age groups, such as the experience of the lecturers, such as the contact time with lecturers, such as the syllabus content, different qualifications, different demographics, etc., etc. With quantitative study, It can be used systematically to describe large collections of data. We can have very large samples in quantitative studies, and it can be used to generate reproducible knowledge. For example, an experiment undertaken in a laboratory in England, for example, if the procedure is fully documented, then that could be given to somebody, say in America, in their laboratory, and under the same conditions, following the same experimental process, they should be able to replicate the results in a different setting. Although a disadvantage of quantitative study is it can require statistical training to analyse the data, and also sometimes can require larger samples. Some further terms we need to clarify for ourselves are the difference between primary and secondary research. So primary research, the advantages are it can be collected to answer specific research questions, and the researcher has control over the sampling and the measurement methods chosen. Disadvantage of primary research is it is more expensive and time-consuming to collect. It also can require training in data collection methods. In contrast, secondary research, that's easier and faster to access because other people have undertaken this, so using other researchers' studies and their findings. It can also collect data that spans longer timescales and broader geographical locations. The disadvantage of secondary research is that you have no control over how the data was generated and collected. It may not be as rigorous as you would prefer it to be. In a particular research article, it may not clearly state how it was collected, so you're unsure how the data was generated and the validity of the data that was collected. Also, secondary data requires careful consideration to ensure it is suitable for use in the new study. Are the parameters and the conditions under which the previous study was undertaken comparable and compatible with the study you are now trying to undertake? And also the secondary data may not be up to date. It may not be current research, and that could be important to your new study. So let's consider what are called qualitative research strategies, the choices and the options. So in the left-hand column here we have the type of research strategy, and the right-hand column we have the description. So we could undertake experimental research. This tendency to use quantitative research methods, but it can actually form part of a qualitative study because we may use quantitative methods to reduce down our sample size to a selected number of people that we then may want to interview or survey further. We can have comparative research. That's where the researcher is comparing two case studies or two surveys. We can undertake longitudinal research. This is where research is undertaken over a long period of time and can relate to life histories. Evaluation research is where we analyse the impact, the operation, etc. of research that another researcher has instigated. Action research is where the researcher formulates and implements the change to a particular environment. But in this case, we need to be very careful because the researcher forms part of the study itself. So this is where we have to be careful we don't introduce bias into the research because of the researcher's values and perspectives. And there's something called the case study as a research strategy. This is where we undertake detailed investigation of a single case, for example, associated with a community or an organisation. In a previous video, we outlined a research proposal of a student who was researching implementing smart farming techniques into a small island community. So that could be classified as a case study. It's a single case associated with a community on an island. Now, as we mentioned on the previous slide, the problem with that single site case study is that it may not be able to be generalized to other small communities. Let's consider qualitative research methodology, theoretical perspectives. So in qualitative research, there is a recognition that collection and interpretation of data are influenced by a set of values belonging to the researcher. As I said before, with the scientific method that's used in, say, an engineering context, the method tries to remove any researcher bias from the experimentation and so from the research findings. But that's not necessarily the case with qualitative studies. So a range of theoretical perspectives apply to evaluate information of the qualitative type. So a good starting point when scoping for the study would be to examine 4 commonly used observational approaches, as stated on the table on the next slide. You'll notice that these 4 approaches have their origins in the sciences, anthropology, sociology, and philosophy, respectively, although they are now widely used across all academic disciplines. So here are some qualitative research methodology theoretical perspectives. There's something called field research. This approach to qualitative research involves the collection and the analysis and the description of observations from natural environments beyond the laboratory. So field research requires methodological and detailed note-taking that has to be coded before it can be analysed, and so the phenomena described. Fieldwork research is used in many disciplines and can be part of the process of some of the approaches listed below. The nature of collecting, coding, analysing and describing can differ according to the discipline and context. And again, that's why we need to be very clear about the methodology and methods used in qualitative study, as they can be quite diverse depending on the discipline and the context we're considering. A second theoretical perspective is called ethnography. This approach aims to describe and understand cultural phenomena. Ethnography is based on participant observation in the form of field research. In this approach, groups or organisations are observed in a natural context over a relatively short period. Members of such groupings share common experiences, whether by virtue of social context, location or practices, and it's their behaviours in the context of this mutual experience that researchers aim to investigate. So if you want to understand the working relationships within an office environment, for example, you as a researcher would have to immerse yourself in that environment and basically become part of the environment, so you didn't affect the research findings, but you're effectively a fly on the wall throughout the duration of the research. Further qualitative theoretical perspectives. There is something called grounded theory, and this approach aims to understand social phenomena through real life or grounded observations in group contexts. So from this perspective, through an iterative coding process, a better understanding is reached regarding both events or problems, and then explanations or solutions for them can be found. This process does not begin with a hypothesis, but starts with general questions that may be further refined, and that can lead to the creation of more questions as ideas develop over time. The data generated are analysed and tentatively linked to theoretical concepts, new or existing, and later in the process, core aspects of the relationships between these and their associated theoretical underpinnings are identified. So essentially, grounded theory is a research method concerned with the generation of theory. It's grounded in the data that has been systematically collected and analysed. It's used to uncover such things as social relationships and behaviours of groups, known as social processes. Finally, we've got phenomenology. This is an observational technique that involves longer-term, detailed study of small groups of people. There are several schools of thought that exist regarding this approach, but the common focus is on philosophical thinking about essential questions of how to define being and knowledge. In its practical application, the phenomena studied relate to participants' subjective interpretations of experience and the world surrounding them, sometimes referred to as their lived experience. A phenomenologist tries to reach better understandings of these lived experiences. So as you understand the detail that's on those two slides related to qualitative theoretical perspectives, you can see there's much more subjectivity, much more variation in the way qualitative research methodologies are developed and applied. This is a consideration we do not have in the scientific method we use in physics and engineering orientated research studies. Let's now consider examples of research methods used for data collection. So in the left-hand column here we have research method. The second column we have whether it's primary or secondary research. Third column, qualitative or quantitative research. And in the right-hand column we have the application. So experimentation as a research method. This is considered primary in its source. It's quantitative in nature. It may be that the experiment is trying to consider the effects of temperature on a certain metal in a certain environment. And so we will get test data in the terms of numerical values, maybe stresses and strains, temperature readings, that we can use to then test the cause and effect relationships associated with the research. And this will relate to the hypothesis we are considering. The next research method is a survey, usually self-completion questionnaires that we devise as a method. Again, this is a primary source, generally considered quantitative, because maybe the questionnaire is based on a Likert scale, for example, where the participants are ticking numbered boxes for their response. And we often use the survey method to understand general characteristics of a population. For example, a workforce perspective on leadership characteristics of the management. Next research method is the interview, and these can be structured, where the researcher generates a list of specific questions and will only ask those questions in the interview. They can be semi-structured interviews, where again a list of questions are proposed by the researcher, and the researcher will ask all those questions, but will also allow deviation around the questions with the intention of collecting a wider array of data. Although they can be unstructured, but I would advise against unstructured interviews. Again, the interview is considered a primary source of data, and it's a qualitative source of data. In most cases, we are probably taking notes during the interview of the response to the questions, or preferably we're recording it with the permission of the participant that we will transcribe later in great detail. We use interviews to gain a more in-depth understanding of a research topic using this one-to-one format. So it might be we use a survey of a large array of people to find general characteristics and general responses, and maybe certain responses we're particularly interested in, and we might want to delve deeper into the reasons for those responses, and that's when we might consider then an interview to find richer data from individual participants. Examples of research methods for data collection continued here. So next research method is the focus group. Again, that's primary data, it's qualitative data. And again, we're trying to gain in-depth understanding of a topic, but this time using a group format as opposed to a one-to-one format. An observation, something we use in field research. Again, it's primary data. It can be either qualitative or quantitative. It could be qualitative because we're analysing a person's reactions to certain encounters within their working environment. So we're observing their characteristics, their traits, their expressions, etc. Or it could be quantitative because we're counting the number of times a person undertakes a certain activity. We use observation to understand how something occurs in its natural setting. The literature review as a research method of its own. It says here that the data is classified as secondary. Now, it's secondary in the context it's not the current researcher who's collecting the data, but is a primary source if it comes from, for example, peer-reviewed journal articles. That would be considered the primary source of data, but it's a secondary source for the researcher as such. Again, this can be either qualitative or quantitative, and it can be used to situate proposed research in an existing body of knowledge or to evaluate trends within a specific area of research. And finally, the case study. This can be either primary or secondary, and it can be either qualitative or quantitative. As mentioned previously, we use a case study to gain an in-depth understanding of a specific group or a context, or when resources for a large study are not available. Let's now consider examples of research methods used for analysing data. So once you've collected the data through various methods, you have to analyse the data, and the approach to analysis of the data relates to the methodology used and the research methods chosen. So considering the research method of statistical analysis, so that's analysing data that's collected in a statistically valid manner, for example using experiments, surveys, observations, etc. There's something called a meta-analysis, which is an analysis of the analyses, and that's considered to be a quantitative approach to analysis. So to statistically analyse the results of a large collection of quantitative studies. But it should only be applied to studies that collected data in a statistically valid manner. And the validity you will find from the research article or research paper you're using. It will no doubt have a methodology and method section, and from that hopefully you'll be able to glean whether the data was collected in a statistically valid manner. Examples of research methods for analysing data is continued here. A term I've not heard before, metasynthesis. Again, this is stated as an analysis of the analyses, but this now is applied to qualitative research. So to systematically review and integrate findings from qualitative studies. It's an emerging technique using a variety of different methods. The method used must be appropriate to the specific field in which it is to be used. So again, as with all qualitative studies, as I expect you're beginning to understand now, there can be a raft of different approaches and different methods used. So we need to consider the methodology used in the qualitative study and see if the methods were appropriate for that methodology for collecting the data related to the research questions. A thematic analysis, this relates to qualitative studies. So undertaking surveys or interviews, it's likely you'll be using a thematic analysis to analyse data collected via those methods. So to analyse data collected from interviews, focus groups, any textual sources, for example, surveys, questionnaires, and the thematic analysis tries to understand general themes in the data and how they are communicated within the data. That is, within the responses of the participants. Is it a theme related to something the participant explicitly said, or is it a theme that's evolving from lateral thinking, if you like, of comments made by participants in the interviews? It could be something a participant says that rings bells with aspects of literature review, so there's connections there and the themes may be drawn then directly from the literature review maybe. And finally, content analysis. This is defined as either qualitative or quantitative. So content analysis is used to analyse large volumes of textual or visual data collected from surveys, literature reviews or other sources, So a content analysis can be quantitative, and it is counting the frequencies of words used. So literally counting the number of times participants have used a particular word or a particular phrase. That may be reviewing interview transcripts, or it might be from feedback from a questionnaire. And it's also considered qualitative when we're looking for the meanings of the words used. So the way perhaps the participants are using words, a particular context in which they're using them, etc. So those two slides have outlined methods used for analysing data as opposed to collecting data. I found the following table in the source state at the bottom of the slide here, which I thought was very encompassing as it considers qualitative and quantitative research and compares the two together. I'm just going to outline a few of the responses in this table, and I'm going to let you consider them at your own pace. I think it's a particularly useful table to help compare and contrast qualitative research and quantitative research. If we consider initially the purpose of the study, then for qualitative research it's to understand and interpret social interactions, whereas I've already mentioned in quantitative work it's to test an hypothesis and look at cause and effect from which we can make predictions. If we consider the type of data collected, for example, in qualitative research that will be words, images or objects, and in quantitative work that will be numbers and statistics. If we consider the form of data collected, qualitative data can relate to open-ended responses to questions, interviews, participant observations, field notes, reflections, etc. Quantitative data is based on precise measurements from our experiments using structured and validated data collection instruments. If we consider the type of data analysis, then for a qualitative study we try to identify patterns, features or themes from our data. Maybe we've interviewed several people, we've got our research questions and responses to the research questions, and we're looking for commonalities between the data of the different participants, whether there is divergence between the responses, but we're looking for themes that are common in the data. In contrast, for qualitative research, we often use statistical relationships. This can involve mean, modes, medians, calculating the standard deviation, t-tests, related to normal distribution curves, etc., etc. Considering objectivity and subjectivity, in qualitative research, subjectivity is expected and has to be accounted for. The researchers is in the study, so their perspectives, their biases, their value system needs to be stated clearly in the research so that the reader understands their background and how that might influence the research itself and the findings and the conclusions that are drawn from the study. In contrast with qualitative work, objectivity is critical, and using the scientific method we outlined previously tries to eliminate the subjectivity associated with quantitative research. The role of the researcher. In qualitative work, the researcher and their biases may be known to the participants in the study, and participant characteristics may be known to the researcher. And again, this can all impact on the data gathered from the research process. In quantitative research, the researcher and their biases are not known to the participants in the study, and the participant characteristics are deliberately hidden from the researcher. Obviously, with scientific work, where we're undertaking experiments, these biases are only in terms of the researcher. But with the scientific method, again, by clearly documenting the procedures involved that can be replicated, the biases of the researcher are hopefully eliminated from the study. And the results in qualitative work is particular or specialized findings that are not often generalizable across different contexts. With quantitative research, findings are generalizable and can be applied to other populations, other situations, other contexts. So the scientific method. In qualitative work, that's considered exploratory or bottom-up. The researcher generates a new hypothesis and theory from the data collected. Going back to grounded theory, for example, from the data collected, theory is evolved. But with quantitative studies, it's confirmatory or top-down. The researcher tests the hypothesis and theory with the data gathered. I will leave you to browse the rest of the table, which also continues on the next slide. As I said, I consider this a very thorough overview of the contrast between qualitative and quantitative research. And here's the final slide of the table. Just notice the last row here related to the final report. For qualitative research, a narrative report with contextual description and direct quotations from research participants will be produced. And in contrast with quantitative research, it's likely to be a statistical report with correlations and comparisons of means and statistical significance of the findings. Again, this table has been extracted from the source stated. So finally, to try and answer the question I started with associated with research methods, you have to produce an essay related to research methods. Hopefully you have a better understanding of what research methods are. So below I've outlined a suggested structure for the essay you're going to produce. I would encourage you to have an introduction section which overviews the background to the research study that's been undertaken. Have a section that outlines the aim of the research study. This could include a statement of the aims and objectives. That could be a hypothesis for a quantitative study or research questions for a qualitative study. And where appropriate, state the theoretical perspective that's been adopted, as we've outlined in the previous part of this presentation. Section 3 should review the differences between primary and secondary research and data. And Section 4 should review the differences between quantitative and qualitative research and data. And in Section 5, this is where you actually examine the research method used for data collection. This is expected to be the largest section of the report, and it should outline an array of various methods that can be used and why they're used, relating to both primary and secondary research. For methods applied in your particular study, you should clearly state why these were chosen, and so justify their selection for your particular research study. And just as an outline, the methods you might be considering in this essay are questionnaires, focus groups, observations, use of interviews, maybe experiments, etc., etc. You should then have a section that discusses the merits, the limitations, and the difficulties of the approaches to data collection analysis related to the above methods. And then finally, you should critically analyse the data analysis that you have undertaken and critically analyse the strategies employed to overcome the challenges that were encountered. For reference, here's a list of command words associated with the criteria related to the essay you have to produce. The PASS criterion states to examine appropriate research methods and approaches to primary and secondary research. So the command word examine in this context will be to investigate the research methods required. The merit criterion says to discuss merits, limitations, and pitfalls of approaches to data collection and analysis. So the command word discuss will mean to consider different aspects of the approaches to data collection analysis, how they interrelate, and the extent to which they are important. And finally, the distinction criterion says to critically analyse data analysis conducted and strategies to deal with challenges that occurred. So to satisfy the critically analyze command words, you'll need to separate the information into components and identify characteristics with depth to the justification. So that's just for reference to try and provide you with an indication as to how the higher grades require more in-depth thought process and to display greater understanding. Here's the bibliography used to help generate the presentation. And I hope now the presentations at least clarified some of the terminology for you between methodology and methods, between quantitative and qualitative research, and between primary and secondary research. It's now hope that you will be able to build on this presentation, do your own research into these particular aspects of your project, and undertake the essay related to research methods as outlined at the beginning of the presentation. Thank you for viewing.